All right, finally, let's break down UFC 226. What's going on, everybody? Welcome to Fight Scene. On this channel, we talk about things that are happening in the world of MMA and combat sports. Today, I want to do a video on UFC 226, which is happening July 7th. And the main event is one of the biggest fights they've put on all year. The biggest heavyweight fight, in my opinion, of all time. I think maybe that's a bit of a stretch, but certainly up there for one of the biggest heavyweight fights ever. I've been meaning to put out this video for a really long time. This is my breakdown and prediction video on the full card. If you look at the YouTube description below here, you're going to see individual video links to longer versions of each of the fights on the card. Michael Chiesa versus Anthony Pettis. What was the other one? Francis Ngannou versus Derek Lewis, Max Holloway versus Brian Ortega, and Stipe versus Daniel Cormier. So this is my full video that breaks down the entire card and gives my predictions on the full card, the prelims, the main card, everything. And I've been meaning to put out this video for a really long time. A couple of things have gotten in my way. I've had the worst. I had the wisdom tooth issue, and I haven't been able to talk properly. And even today, I'm still having some pain with my wisdom teeth. I had one removed and just brutal. So that got in my way. And I've actually been meaning to put out these videos on UFC 226 a really long time ago, because when I first started my channel back in February, they announced the main event of Daniel Cormier versus Stipe Miocic. And I was really excited for that card, or for that fight. And I thought, oh, I'll get my prediction video out as soon as possible and it'll be online for a long time. And I've been putting it off, and I've been putting it off, and I've been putting it off. And part of the reason is that I keep flip-flopping on my opinion on so many of these fights. I just can't nail down a prediction on what I actually think is going to happen on July 7th. And so this is it. This is my video. I can't put it off any longer. I expect to be wrong a couple of times, and this is just going to me giving my initial thoughts. Well, not just my initial thoughts. I guess I've been thinking about it for a really long time, but my thoughts on the card that's happening. And you know, I might even change my mind between now and next Saturday. This card is just so good. In my opinion, this is one of the best UFC cards, certainly, that they put on all year, but maybe one of the best cards that they've ever put on. I think that this heavyweight fight is just monumental. I think it's super important, and it's definitely up there with the UFC 187s, the UFC 100s. To me, on International Fight Week, this is the kind of card that you want. Last year, the International Fight Week card was only so-so. I can't even really remember who it was, but this year they finally really got some good fights on there. So without further ado, let's get right into the undercard, and I'll give you some of my predictions for the fights. Now, last time I did one of these videos, I got so much flack for two different things. One, saying I didn't know who somebody was, and I apologize to the internet and all the MMA fans out there who were very offended that there were some fighters on an undercard that I didn't know who they were. There are so many fights these days. There are a fight card every weekend, and there's going to be some fighters that I might not remember in the moment, right? I got a camera, I got some lights on, and so forgive me in advance if I tell you I don't really know who somebody is, because they might be newer, or I just haven't paid as much attention to them, or I'm going to mispronounce some names. Most notably, I'm going to pronounce Stipe's name wrong a number of times in this video and in my other video on that fight. So if that bothers you, you should probably turn off now, because I'm going to pronounce some names wrong. So let's get right into it. First, we have a women's strawweight fight between Jamie Moyle and Emily Whitmire. Again, these are not fighters that I'm very familiar with, so it's a little bit more difficult for me to make a pick. Actually, I'm not going to. I didn't really research that one. I thought I had looked into it, but I hadn't looked into it. I believe that it's Emily's first fight in the UFC, and so by default, I suppose I'll go with Jamie. Maybe not. Sometimes those first fights in the UFC, there's some champion in a regional division. Actually, almost always they're a champion in some regional fight promotion, and they're this up-and-comer. So, I mean, that's a toss-up. I'm not even really going to make a prediction on that one. But then the next fight on the card is Lando Venata versus Jakar Close. And I'll take Lando Venata in that fight. I think that he has a lot of potential. He can be a little flashy sometimes, and as much as that's super interesting to watch, I think sometimes maybe it gets in the way of just sort of fundamental footwork and attacks. But he's super fun to watch. I think that this is probably a do or die fight for him. He had that good strong performance against names are escaping me this afternoon. He had that really strong performance against Tony. Even though he lost that fight, he had looked pretty good in that fight for coming in on short notice and whatnot. And I think that this is probably a bit of a do-or-die fight. He's already on the prelims. He has been on main cards in the past, but I'll take Lando Venat in that fight. Then we have Dan Hooker versus Gilbert Burns. Dan Hooker looked really great in his last fight, and to make this video as brief and as short as possible, I'll just let you know that I would take Dan Hooker in that fight. So that's the end of the Fight Pass prelims. Then we go on to the Fox Sports 1 prelims, and we have Curtis Millender versus Max Griffin. And I will take... I'll take Max Griffin in that fight. Again, I hadn't noted on here who I thought when I was looking at these previously today. I thought I had noted who I had picked in this fight, but I'll take Max Griffin in this fight. Then we have Rafael Assunção versus Rob Font. I'll take Rafael Assunção in that fight. And then we get to Yancy Medeiros versus Mike Perry. And this was a real challenge for me as I was thinking about these fights. And this is why some of these other ones I can't quite remember who I was picking, because I was spending so much time thinking about these other ones, which are really like toss-ups in my mind about who to take in the fight. They dominated a lot of my attention when looking at this card. And I think the challenge here is that I absolutely think that Mike Perry is the kind of mixed martial artist that can win this fight. And I think that he has the stopping power to win this fight. And I think that he has the potential to win this fight. But his last few fights just have fallen kind of flat. And Yancy Medeiros, you know, he is coming off a loss as well against Donald Cerrone, but this one could really go either way. And so it's one of those fights where one day I was thinking, oh, I think Yancy will win this fight. The next day I'm thinking Mike Perry will win this fight. I wasn't 100% sure. At this point, when I'm turning on the video and having to make the official final prediction, I'm going to take Yancy Medeiros in that fight by decision. I don't think that fight will be stopped. If the fight does end by stoppage, I believe it will be stopped because Mike Perry lands that big bomb that we've seen from him in the past. Then we have, and this is a super interesting fight, we have Uriah Hall versus Paulo Costa. Now, to me, this is the fight to watch on this card. I mean, there's so many really good ones, but to me, this one is one of the most interesting stories that can be played out. I believe that the UFC does sometimes does a really good job and sometimes does a really bad job at building up fighters to be a really marketable name and a real contender in the division. Where we've seen it gone not very well is an example like Sage Northcutt would be a good example of that. You know, young guy, full of potential, some decent skills, but then they kind of threw him into some pretty heavy matchups early, and he lost some key matchups as a result of some, you know, big weaknesses in his game. And then his star power did sort of fade a little bit. I mean, he's still Sage, so he's still out there on the what are the commercials anyway? In Canada, I don't really pay much attention to them, but he does have a couple of those commercials with Demetrius Johnson, and he does still have some drawing power. But sometimes the UFC does a really good job at building up people slowly. And what I think they're doing a good job at is with Paulo Costa, giving him the right kind of people to build him up to be an absolute superstar. First of all, if you just look at the guy, he's about as marketable as they come. He's from Brazil, where they have this massive fan base, and they really want to make sure that they're maintaining really good stars. And some of those are kind of retiring. Some of those stars are starting to leave the game. I mean, there's always going to be Brazilian stars, don't get me wrong. I'm sure some people are going to point out about which ones that already are still there. But Paulo, to me, is the next one from Brazil to be just a massive superstar. He's got the look. He has the fighting ability, but they got to be careful not to throw him in to the fire too quickly. So they did a good job placing him against Johnny Hendricks. I mean, that was a terrible matchup for Johnny Hendricks. And Paulo Costa, whatever his name was back then, looked fantastic in that fight. And so I think this is the right matchup for somebody like Paulo at this point in his career. You have Uriah Hall also coming from the Ultimate Fighter, Paulo coming from the Ultimate Fighter Brazil, I believe, I believe he lost the fight. He didn't win the Ultimate Fighter, so he lost the fight on the Ultimate Fighter. You could correct me if I'm wrong there. I could be wrong. Again, it was the Brazilian version of the Ultimate Fighter. I don't even really watch the Ultimate Fighter anymore. It's gotten a bit stale for me, but I certainly don't watch the Brazilian version of the Ultimate Fighter. So I believe he lost the fight on there. So it's not like he's invincible, but his official MMA record is undefeated, and this is a perfect fight for him. What I'm not sure about, because most of Paulo's fights end in the first round. If you look at his record, it was like 9 fights, first round TKOs, first round stoppages, and then you had, I think it was the second round against Johnny Hendricks. The challenge there is, I don't know if his cardio could be an issue. I mean, he does carry so much muscle. I remember one of his fights, it did look like maybe he was getting a little bit tired, but even then, I can't remember the guy's name. He was another sort of wild style fighter, and he actually looked pretty good in the first round. But Paulo Costa so far has looked, I don't want to say unbeatable, but he's definitely looked really impressive, and I think this is the perfect fight for him to just continue to leverage that star power that he's getting. The challenge is that you never know what kind of Uriah Hall is going to show up for the fight. You have ones that look amazing. He has a win. He has some really impressive wins, and some of the names are escaping me at the moment, but I think he has the experience to win this fight. But to me, Paulo Costa is just too much for Uriah Hall, and I think that he'll win this fight. I don't expect he'll win it by decision. Uriah Hall, really tough guy to stop, but I think Paulo Costa can get it done probably in the first or second round. So I'm going to take Paulo Costa in that fight. Then we get into the main card. This is where the really exciting stuff happens. Sorry if I was going through those ones too fast for you. We're probably too far into this video already, but I want to get to the main card here. You have Gokhan Saki versus Khalil Roundtree Jr., and I think this is maybe another good example of they're playing their cards right with Gokhan Saki, is that he's this world-renowned kickboxer. His stand-up is impeccable. There's not many that can stand toe-to-toe with him in trade. You saw that in his last fight. If somebody stands in the pocket with him, it's going to be a bad fight. Now, if you face him up against a strong wrestler and jiu-jitsu fighter, that's not going to be a good matchup for him. He just hasn't developed that point, and he might not ever develop that level of ground game given the later stages of his career. He's been pretty vocal, or he was open about some of his weaknesses in his first fight. This is his second fight in the UFC. Second fight, I think, in MMA at all, and he went right to the UFC, which is pretty unheard of. But that, I mean, that's the UFC these days. But I think they've done a good job. They've put him lower on this card, highlight some of his star power, but given him a fairly favorable matchup that I think he can win, elevate his drawing power a little bit more without going too far. They're doing a good job at building him up slowly enough to become a major draw for maybe like headlining a fight night and over the next year or something like that. So I'll take Gokhan Saki in that fight by probably second round TKO. I think it'll take him a bit of a round to just get warmed up, get used to the lights again, and then find his power. Big left hook, I think we'll see from him, or something like that. And just I expect a stoppage in that fight. So I'll take Gokhan Saki. Then we get to Michael Chiesa versus Anthony Pettis. You can take a look at my video. It's in the YouTube description. There's a link there. I think over here I can put a little link. You can click on that to see the full breakdown video I did on these guys. I did it a number of weeks ago, and because it was a couple weeks ago, I can't fully remember who I picked. But I remember that when it comes to this fight, and you can hear me talk about it in more detail, that I believe that Anthony Pettis has all the tools to win and beat Michael Chiesa. If we see that return to form that we've had from Anthony Pettis in the past, if we can get him back to that championship level fighter, then I believe that he is the better fighter in this matchup. That being said, we haven't seen that from Anthony Pettis in at least, what, 4 years? I mean, it's been a while. We haven't seen a lot from Anthony Pettis that gives me the confidence to think that he would win this fight. Whereas Michael Chiesa, even though he lost to Kevin Lee, you know, he's had more recent success and has shown that I think that he's evolved with the sport better than Anthony Pettis. And so I believe in that video I picked Michael Chiesa. At this point, I would take Michael Chiesa. Now, Anthony Pettis, if he can get some momentum off of his brother's win, and when I say momentum, I mean in my video when I talked about Michael Chiesa versus Anthony Pettis, I talked about their training camp and where they were training and how hard they were training. And I know he's not his brother, but if they've changed something up, like that was a big win for Sergio Pettis, in my opinion. So if they have changed something up in their camp, then maybe Anthony Pettis can pull this off. But right now, I think you have to pick Michael Chiesa in this fight, just based on what we've seen from Anthony Pettis over the next couple years. But if Anthony Pettis were to win it, I wouldn't be super surprised, because I think that he has all the tools he needs to win this fight. It's just stringing them together and flowing between them, I think, that he's really struggled with over the last little while. And you know, I hate to say it out loud, but I mean, since there's been a lot of people saying that there's some of these fighters that since USADA came in just haven't looked the same. The news happened yesterday that Johnny Hendricks has retired. I mean, he's not that old, and he's just looked terrible since USADA came in. So make of it what you will, draw your own conclusions, but Anthony Pettis is kind of in that boat, so I'm interested to see what he looks like next Saturday. Then we have Francis Ngannou versus Derek Lewis. I've made a full video on that. You can check that out up here and also in the link in the YouTube description. So, you know, this fight could go either way, like I said in my last video. Francis Ngannou kind of has something to prove in this one. I think that I don't want to say was embarrassed by the Stipe loss, but we all expected a little bit more from him, I think. I think a lot of people were picking him to win because of the success he had been having to get the title shot. And then he kind of got there and you're like, oh my gosh, I had no idea that and Brandon Schaub's been saying this for a long time, so I'm sort of stealing the line, but he has no wrestling skills at all. And so if he's been working on that, that'd be interesting. I don't expect that you're going to see that in this particular fight. I think you're going to see two guys stand and bang, for lack of a better term, and that's what we want to see when people put this fight together. I mean, we just wanted to see a really fun matchup between these two guys, and we got it. And I'm super excited for this fight. I think that Francis has a lot to prove. I think a lot of people are saying that obviously they believe that he'll win. I totally get that. But there's this component where I think that Derek Lewis could pull it out. I don't necessarily see him knocking out Francis Ngannou, but we've seen, I mean, I don't want to say a wrestling game out of Derek. Certainly that's not the right term, but we've seen that he's okay in the clinch, and if it does go on the ground, how do I say this? He knows how to kind of get back up. And there were some videos, and I mentioned this in the other one, about Francis Ngannou training jiu-jitsu, and they were just terrible. They were just awful. And so you can take a look at my full video on that if you want more my opinion on that. But in this fight, I do expect Francis Ngannou to win by decision, I think. I keep changing my mind on this one. I mean, I think it's a really good fight. It really is hard to say, because Francis looked so good coming up to his title shot. And then if ever a fighter has been exposed, I think Francis was exposed. His skill level was exposed in his title shot against Stipe. I don't like using the term exposed. I've never really thought of people in that way. Like when people were saying that Ronda was exposed, I completely disagreed. But in Francis's fight, I actually kind of felt like maybe the hype train was a little too strong going into that one. And so this is a big fight for Francis to prove that he is who we thought he was. And you know what? I will take Francis Ngannou in this fight. That's what I said in my previous video, and I'll stick by that. Then second to last, and I haven't actually filmed the video. I'm going to do that right after this one. For Max Holloway versus Brian Ortega, I haven't filmed this one because I just can't make up my mind. This fight could go either way. This card is so good because so many of these fights, they really could go either way. There's no clear favorite. I know there's a Vegas favorite, but in my mind, there's no real actual clear favorite here. We've seen so many things from both fighters that tells you that they're going to win. Max Holloway, his footwork is impeccable. His kickboxing is impeccable. The way that he draws you into a fight is just second to none. Brian Ortega, submitting guys left, right, and center, knocked out Frankie Edgar, never been done before. Who in their right mind thought that Brian Ortega was even going to win a fight against Frankie Edgar, but let alone knock him out? I don't think there was anybody thinking that he was going to get knocked out. And what that showed me is that he's a big featherweight. Brian Ortega is a big featherweight. He's undefeated, and he possesses the skills to beat Max Holloway, but Max Holloway is also on another level. So what this fight boils down to me here is, can Brian Ortega do what he's done every time and get a hold of Max Holloway? Again, Max's footwork and ability to come in and out of the pocket is so good. I don't know that he can, but if he can somehow get a hold of Max Holloway, there are official statuses that Max Holloway is a purple belt, Brian Ortega is a black belt. I mean, take that with a grain of salt because they're sort of MMA submission grappling. I mean, belt levels aren't everything, but I do know that Brian Ortega has an advantage on the ground if he gets it down there, and I think he could probably submit him. At this point, I believe that Brian Ortega will come out the featherweight champion of the world on July 7th. I think Brian Ortega has what it takes to beat Max Holloway. Now, Max Holloway, really known for wanting to draw people into a brawl. I don't think that this is a good idea against Brian Ortega. I think he does have enough power that if he gets drawn into one of those brawls that he's so famous for, not just the Ricardo Lamas fight where he pointed to the ground, but look at what he did against Jose Aldo in that second fight where he absolutely baited him into just exchanging against the fence there, and he is perfect in that chaos. Max Holloway deals with that chaos better than any fighter I've ever seen. I don't know that that's a good idea to do against Brian Ortega if he has that kind of power and size advantage that we saw in the Frankie Edgar fight. I believe that Brian Ortega will be the much bigger fighter in this one, and for that reason, not alone, but for that combined with what we've seen from him in the past, I think that Brian Ortega comes out with the victory. But I think he does that by some sort of stoppage. If this fight ends up going to the decision, I think it's probably pretty likely that Max Holloway kind of did what he did against Ricardo Lamas, where he just controlled the fight from the very beginning. Again, a 5-round fight, so that's going to be interesting. But at this point, I'm taking Brian Ortega. I wouldn't be shocked either way. I think this one is a coin flip. I think these guys are both world class. And excuse me, I should say I would be really happy to see Brian Ortega win this fight, because potentially then you have, and I know that I talk about Conor McGregor a lot in these videos, but right now it's a little bit stale in the division because I think a lot of the discussion has been, well, he's already beaten Max Holloway, so why would he ever return to featherweight? And there's a good chance that Conor never returns to featherweight. But if Brian Ortega is champion, that to me, that's a little bit of a different story. You might start to see him talk a little bit more about a return to featherweight. So who knows? That'd be interesting. But I'd like to see Brian Ortega win this fight. I like him. I like his story. I like that he's jiu-jitsu focused. I like that he trains out of the Gracie Academy. And I believe that he has what it takes to win this fight. And then lastly, and I won't spend too much time on this one because I have a full video. You can check that out over here. Click up here in the YouTube card or the link in the description, where you can see my full video breaking down Stipe Miocic versus Daniel Cormier. I have, since February, absolutely changed my opinion on this fight every other day. I cannot make up my mind about who I think is going to win this fight. This one is so close. What we've seen from both fighters tells me that they both would win. I think if these guys fight 10 times, I think they split the difference so many of the times. It's such a close fight. I know for most people, they think it's fairly clear-cut for Stipe, but I don't believe it. If you look at what we've seen from Daniel Cormier, not just as a light heavyweight champion, but as a heavyweight, there's nothing that has told us that he can be stopped in the octagon, with the exception of a very close decision loss. It was closer than you think it was to John Jones, and then the knockout. But before the knockout, Daniel Cormier was looking really fantastic. I'm not going to talk about John and steroids. Knockouts happen, and it could happen on July 7th with Stipe, but he was actually looking really good striking against John Jones before that had occurred, and I think he's likely corrected the mistakes because he was very aware of them. If you listen to press conferences beforehand, he even talked about dipping to the left or whatever in one of the... He's aware of the error. I think he's likely corrected it. As it stands right now, I will probably change my mind 3 more times before next Saturday, but for this video, I have to go with Daniel Cormier. I believe that wrestling is the X factor in this fight. I know that Stipe is a great wrestler, but he's not on Daniel Cormier's level. And we've seen Daniel against bigger fighters, guys like Josh Barnett, guys like Bigfoot Silva, Frank Mir. We've seen that his pressure is just too much. And I said this in one of my other videos. I believe that Colby Covington versus RDA was the template of how this fight will go. I think it looks very, very, very similar. And I think I think that the size difference isn't as significant as people think it is. Daniel Cormier won't have to cut weight for this fight. He's talked about walking around at 240, 238-ish. Stipe will come in. I can't remember. I had written it down before, but he'll come in around, I think it was 250, 252 or something like that. I mean, the size difference isn't that big. The reach difference is big. The height difference is big. I'd say boxing difference, ability in boxing is very big, advantage for Stipe. But I believe that Daniel Cormier, his pressure, his style of fighting is enough to get this done. I believe that he wins this fight by decision. I believe he wins it by very, very close decision. I think he probably gets dropped at least once in this fight, but I think he recovers. And we might even see this fight is so good on paper, but we might actually see a fairly boring fight if we look what he did against somebody like Anderson Silva, where he just pins them down and hangs on for dear life to get that belt. Part of me wants to see this for Daniel Cormier. I've never been a big fan of him. I don't want to say I'm a hater, but I've not been a big fan of Daniel Cormier over the years. I don't know what it is. It's just the camp of AKA. I've said that in videos before. But he has that shadow over his head of never really having his own belt. It didn't happen in the Olympics. He does have the light heavyweight championship belt, but there is that big shadow of John Jones over his head. This would be his, and there's something about that story that I want to see happen for Daniel Cormier. But beyond the story, I do think he has the skills to win this fight. So, okay, I don't know what happened there. My camera all of a sudden stopped. It's probably just its way of telling me that I've gone on way too long. So I'll end this video. Thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate all of you. If you want to check out all of the links down below in the YouTube description for my longer version, this one's long enough as is, but full breakdown videos on each one of those fights, please do that. I really appreciate it. Thank you for everybody who takes some time out of your day to watch these videos. I can't tell you how much I appreciate the positive comments and people supporting this channel just by taking time and attention out of your day to watch them. So thank you so much. We'll talk after this event, I'm sure, a lot about what's gone on, about my picks, about what it means for the heavyweight division in the future. Thanks again. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Bye. Hey, thank you so much for watching this video. I really appreciate you taking some time out of your day to watch this content. I'm just a fan with an opinion and a camera, but I love the sport of MMA. So if you want to see some more videos, you can take a look here on the right of this screen. And other than that, I will catch you in the next video.